Albert Einstein has been quoted as saying, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. Whether Einstein actually said this or not, he certainly embodied the sentiment by recognizing the value of using data to drive decisions. Now, to that point, in a 2018 Forrester survey of more than 1,000 US companies, 91% of them said that data driven decision making was important to their business, while only 57% of them said that they actually used data to make decisions in their business. Isn't that the whole point, though? What about going with your gut, as it were? Well, there's something to be said about your gut or your intuition, but that intuition needs to be informed in order to be reliable. Otherwise, you are in data denial. With that said, how do we get from being in data denial to being data driven? Let me suggest 5 best practices or steps to help us get there. These 5 steps are dominance, relevance, significance, surveillance, and vigilance. Let's dive in. The first step is dominance or look. It's important to start off by looking at the objectives involved and prioritizing them according to your organization's mission, vision, and goals. You're looking for insight. Now, insight has been defined as a finding that contradicts what you know, confirms or denies what you suspect, or quantifies how important that knowledge is. Actionable insight, which is what you really want, goes a step farther by leading you to either act and adapt or to confirm that you don't need to take any action in the first place. See, it's all about overcoming your biases. Bias is the enemy of opportunity. Of course, you can't really ignore your biases and say, well, I'm not biased about anything. That's not entirely accurate. You see, scientists tell us that our brains don't place the same amount of attention on every decision, but instead we take what one neuroscientist, Chris Weller, refers to as mental shortcuts, which of course are better known as biases. Think of these as making up a grid through which we all funnel or filter our decision making process. In and of themselves, biases are neither good nor bad, they're neutral. They can either help us or hurt us. For example, if you're biased about, say, making decisions quickly, well, that can help you if you're in a sinking boat, but it can hurt you if, say, you're trying to figure out who to marry. Research conducted by Weller and his colleagues and many others has identified 5 broad categories of biases, of which I believe 2 are relevant to our topic today. First of all, there's the expedience bias, in which you prefer acting quickly rather than taking time. This one crops up when you're deciding on a course of action after seeing only, say, one graph. Now, you don't take the time to validate what you're looking at, and you could just be led to a wrong decision with faulty data just because the graph looked pretty or the person presenting it to you was pretty convincing. Then there's the experience bias, which affects our tendency to take our perception to be the objective truth. Well, I've seen that before, you might say, or, yeah, that's the way we've always done it, without taking other valid points of view into consideration. So, the best course of action is not to deny these biases or pretend that they don't exist or try to get rid of them, but rather to mitigate them by taking action, such as to pull in more information and reframe the smaller question in the light of a bigger picture. In other words, don't just take that graph at face value or upon first glance. The second step is relevance or link. After you've prioritized your objectives, it's time to find and present relevant data. Link after you've looked. See, your stakeholders need to see how the data being presented is relevant to the situation at hand, the issue being addressed, the flaw being remediated, the defect being recorded, the concern being discussed, or the problem being resolved. As you're presenting and linking the data, it's important to consider the 4 V's of big data, namely volume, velocity, variety, and veracity. The conceptualization you see on your screen was put forth by data scientists from IBM a number of years ago as 4 dimensions or characteristics that make big data, yeah, well, big data. First of all, volume. How much data do you have? Well, these days it's measured in terabytes and petabytes and more, exponentially larger than the kilobytes and megabytes that were used when I started off as an IT professional many years ago. Reuters has estimated the world's storage of data will continue to increase by 50% every year. I mean, a sheer volume, even within moderately sized organizations, requires a huge amount of processing power to analyze and gain insight from. Second V is velocity. Now, that can be expressed in a couple of different ways. The speed at which the data is coming at you or being generated, and also the rate at which it's being consumed. Think of video streaming services such as Amazon Prime, Netflix, and others that, along with their customers, must rely on the availability of massive bandwidth for transmission and discrete processing for analysis. The same principle applies to commodities, stock trading, credit card sales, and other instant transactional based industries in which the speed and timeliness of capture is critical for nailing down patterns and making predictions. For example, the average for the year 2022 was that more than 1.5 billion shares were traded every single day on the NASDAQ and New York Stock Exchanges. Imagine how many individual transactions it takes each day to generate that massive amount of activity. The third V is variety. That is, what are the different sources of data that are available? How complex are they? I alluded a little bit to this when I talked about volume. See, traditional data sources fit very nicely into structures like relational databases, and even when voluminous, are relatively straightforward to extract, analyze, and report on. But then again, there's also the unstructured data, such as images, audio files, and visual files. The more complex stuff that goes way beyond both traditional storage and traditional analysis. Here's how Jason Williamson, assistant professor at the University of Virginia, put it. One of the goals of big data is to use technology to take this unstructured data and make sense of it. The fourth V is veracity. Is this data trustworthy? Can you count on it to be true? Here's something to consider. With the usual business analytics, where volume and variety is smaller, the organization tends to have greater control of the data, and as a result, there's going to be greater veracity. But with big data, on the other hand, with greater volume and variety, comes a greater likelihood of uncertainty. Now, I'm not implying any dishonesty, of course. It's just the nature of the beast that comes with the introduction of more and more unstructured data. Inside Big Data web publisher Stephanie Ehlers warns, what kind of noise and abnormality do you have to deal with? The third step is significance, or listen. You've prioritized your objectives. You've presented relevant data. Well, now it's time to start drawing conclusions from that data. That is, after you've looked and linked, start listening for the significance. There has to be some meaning to what you've seen. See, they're the ones that have the highest priority and relate to your mission, vision, and goals. So start searching for significant patterns, trends, nuances that give indication of the general direction. You have to listen to what the data is telling you, whether it's an upward or a downward trend, a statistical fluctuation, or correlation, maybe nothing at all. You see, finding patterns in order to draw conclusions is nothing new. Why, we've been doing that ever since we were little kids, if you think about it. Let's say Your fifth grade math teacher writes a series of numbers on the board, as you see on the screen here: 42, 36, 31, 27, and 24. Then asks you to determine what the next two numbers will be in the sequence. You think for a minute and then you write 22 and 21. Why is that? Well, because you figured out the pattern that each number was being subtracted by one number less than the one before it, starting with -6, then -5, -4. That is 42 minus 6 is 36, and so forth. See, once you figured out the pattern, and it made it easier for you to know that the next two in the series would subtract 2 and then subtract 1, and that's why you wrote 22 and 21. You see, we continue to use pattern recognition. Maybe we don't see it as such, but if we are to become data-driven in our decision-making, this listening, this drawing of conclusions that I'm talking about needs to be honed by questioning patterns. That is, are they linear? Are they exponential? Are they stationary? Are they damped? Are they seasonal? Are they random? Are they cyclical? That kind of thing. The fourth step is surveillance or leverage, right? You've looked at what has dominance, you've linked what has relevance, and you've listened to what has significance. Now let's leverage what has been gathered. That is, plan your strategy and put what you have so far into practice. You know what? That takes surveillance. Now, there's something to be said about the importance of the planning stage, but hey, planning without execution results in wasted time and failed projects, whereas execution without planning can often lead to disaster. You need to find the right balance between the two for your own situation and leverage those efforts to be able to move forward. Some of the things that can be leveraged would include challenging the status quo, the preconceived notions that you would normally think cannot be contradicted. For example, some people might loudly proclaim, "Oh, you cannot mix quantitative data with qualitative data." Yeah. Well, says who? And since when? You know what? I'm convinced you need both, and you can have both. I believe you can quantify qualitative data, and you can also qualify quantitative data in your step of surveillance. Now, before I tell you what I mean, let's lay a little bit of groundwork and talk about what I mean by quantitative and qualitative data. Let me illustrate it graphically. All right. Quantitative data is what you use when you are trying to determine the what or the how many of an issue. It's generally depicted as data that defines. You have finite, discrete, measurable values or quantities to be, yeah, well, quantified or counted. It is objective, deductive, numbers based, easier to generalize. Suppose you owned a sporting goods store and you wanted to track hiking boot sales over time. That's easily quantifiable, right? Specific number of boots for each day, week, month, whatever period of time that you're looking about it, right? You can plot it very easily. By contrast, rather than defining, qualitative data is data that describes. It's data that can be recorded through observations. It tends to be subjective rather than objective, aligns more with inductive reasoning. It's based more on words rather than numbers, and it's harder to generalize. So, continuing with that sporting goods store analogy, let's say you wanted to gauge customer satisfaction with those hiking boots. So you include a couple of open-ended questions on your survey to ask people to describe how they feel about those boots. Not quite so quantifiable, huh? But still, the two can be leveraged together. You can enrich the quantitative data and pull more qualifying data from it by asking more detailed questions in the data gathering phase. That is, rather than simple yes no questions, determine the extent of their opinion by asking them, say, to rate the boots on a scale of 1 to 5 on several different characteristics. You not only get the discrete values that you can plot on a graph, but you also get more depth into your observations and can therefore tease out a more comprehensive picture. Now, what about qualitative data? How can you quantify something that has no quantity, right? Something that's so ethereal, can't be quantified. It's subjective. How do you take narrative text, for example, and derive some sort of measurable, meaningful pattern from it? Well, may I suggest the use of qualitative analysis software that can read through massive amounts of text and set up a frequency distribution of words that you can then catalog and arrange and put into discrete attributes, buckets, say along a 1 to 5 scale of good to bad, soft to hard, or whatever other contrasting pair you might want to derive. You then have categories that you can measure, plotting them along, say, the number of people in your population who used those terms, gaining even greater depth into the dimensions of the popularity of that particular item, or maybe the lack thereof. Well, we now come to the fifth step, vigilance or learn. After prioritizing, relating, concluding, and surveilling, it's now time to measure your success and repeat. Learn from where you've looked, linked, listened, and leveraged. With this fifth and final step, we see the success in data-driven decision-making cannot be measured until you come to the point where the process is repeatable. Hey, you can't repeat the process if it hasn't been documented, right? If you remember that it worked and you didn't write down how you did it, well, how in the world are you going to know if you can do it again? See, if it's documented, it's repeatable. If it's repeatable, then it's measurable. And if it's measurable, then it can be stacked up against your key performance indicators so you can continually look for ways to improve each time around. But to do that, it takes vigilance. It takes learning to get it to that point. Dr. Milton Maddox, Chief Technology Officer at Castle Shield in Arizona, recently wrote, repeatability is also essential when trying to measure process improvement, making it a critical factor in the ultimate success of all processes within organizations. Well, with that, you've made it from being in data denial to being data-driven. How? Through dominance, relevance, significance, surveillance, and vigilance. In conclusion, on September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov of the Soviet Air Defense Forces was the officer on duty at the Serpukhov 15 bunker near Moscow, which housed the command center of the Soviet early warning satellites, codenamed Oko. On that day, the system reported that a missile had been launched from the United States, followed by up to 5 more. Petrov, for his part, judged the reports to be a false alarm, and his decision to disobey orders against Soviet military protocol is credited with having prevented an erroneous retaliatory nuclear attack on the United States and its NATO allies that could have resulted in a large-scale nuclear war. What's the lesson here? Well, Petrov has been credited with potentially preventing the start of World War III just because he did not pay attention to bad data. So, should you go with your gut? Well, it works both ways, right? Refusing to pay attention with bad data and going with your gut is just as important as listening to the reasoning behind good data and letting it inform your gut, and more importantly, drive your decision making. So in going from being in data denial to being data driven, it's all about dominance, relevance, significance, surveillance, and vigilance. Remember to look, link, listen, leverage, and learn. And hopefully you will go from disaster to delight as you let data drive your decision making. Thanks so much for your time.